The desert wind carried whispers of death across the New Mexico territory in 1887, and three strangers riding into the mining town of Silver Creek had no idea they were about to stumble upon a secret so deadly that powerful men would kill to keep it buried. What started as a simple quest for work in the copper mines would transform into a desperate fight for survival, where the only thing standing between them and a hangman's noose would be an Apache warrior with his own reasons for revenge. The town of Silver Creek sat like a festering wound in the Chihuahuan Desert, its wooden buildings bleached white by the relentless sun and constant wind. Smoke from the copper smelters painted the sky a sickly yellow, and the stench of sulfur mixed with unwashed bodies and rotting hope. It was the kind of place where desperate men came to disappear, and where secrets grew like tumbleweeds in the shadows of every saloon and boarding house. Thomas Mitchell had been riding for 3 days straight when he first saw the smoke rising from Silver Creek's chimneys. His horse was near collapse, his water was running low, and his last $20 was burning a hole in his saddlebags. Behind him, somewhere in the vast emptiness of Arizona territory, a sheriff's posse had given up the chase 2 days ago, but Thomas wasn't taking any chances. He needed work, he needed anonymity, and Silver Creek looked like the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. As he rode down the main street, Thomas noticed something peculiar about the town. Despite the late afternoon hour, there were very few people on the streets. Those he did see moved quickly, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground, as if they were afraid of seeing something they shouldn't. The saloons were quiet, the general store had its shutters half closed, and even the dogs seemed to slink through the shadows rather than bask in the dying sunlight. At the Copper Dollar Saloon, Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the batwing doors. The interior was dimly lit and thick with cigarette smoke, but what struck him most was the silence. A dozen men sat at various tables, nursing their whiskey and speaking in hushed tones that stopped entirely when Thomas entered. The bartender, a heavy-set man with graying hair and nervous eyes, looked up with the expression of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Thomas ordered a whiskey and asked about work in the mines. The bartender's response was cautious, almost fearful. The mines were hiring, he said, but warned Thomas that Silver Creek wasn't like other mining towns. There were rules here, unspoken rules, and men who didn't follow them had a habit of disappearing into the desert. When Thomas pressed for more information, the bartender simply shook his head and moved away to serve another customer. It was then that Thomas noticed the two other strangers in the saloon. One was a young man, barely out of his teens, with the soft hands of someone who had never done hard labor. He sat alone at a corner table, clutching a cup of coffee and looking as out of place as a preacher in a whorehouse. The other was an older man, maybe 50, with the weathered face and steady hands of someone who had spent years working outdoors. Unlike the locals, these two seemed willing to make eye contact, and Thomas recognized the look of fellow outsiders seeking information and opportunity. The young man introduced himself as Benjamin Cole, a former bank clerk from St. Louis who had come west after a scandal involving missing funds had made staying in Missouri impossible. The older man was Frank Morrison, a former railroad foreman who claimed to be looking for a fresh start after his wife died of consumption in Colorado. Neither man seemed entirely truthful about his past, but in a place like Silver Creek, Thomas figured that was probably standard practice. Over the next hour, as the three men shared drinks and carefully edited versions of their life stories, they began to piece together a disturbing picture of their new home. The Consolidated Mining Company owned everything in Silver Creek, from the mines to the general store to the boarding houses where the workers lived. The company's manager, a man named Harrison Blackwood, ruled the town with an iron fist, backed by a small army of private guards who enforced company policy with clubs and guns. But it was the stories about the Apache that really caught their attention. Old-timers in the saloon spoke in whispers about Nailnish, a war chief who had been raiding supply trains and attacking isolated mining operations throughout the territory. Unlike other Apache leaders who focused their attacks on military targets, Nailnish seemed particularly interested in the Consolidated Mining Company's operations. His warriors had struck 3 different mine sites in the past 6 months, but instead of taking supplies or livestock, they seemed focused on destroying equipment and driving workers away. What made these stories even more puzzling was the reaction of the company guards. Rather than increasing security or calling for military assistance, Blackwood had issued orders that no one was to pursue or engage with Nailnish's warriors. Any miner who encountered Apache raiding parties was to retreat immediately and report the incident to company headquarters. Several miners who had ignored these orders and fought back against Apache attacks had been fired and run out of town, despite successfully defending company property. As the evening wore on and the whiskey loosened tongues, Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank began to hear other strange stories about the Consolidated Mining Company. Miners spoke of being forbidden from working certain areas of the mines, even though these sections appeared to contain rich veins of copper ore. Supply wagons arrived and departed at odd hours, often under heavy guard and with their contents hidden under canvas tarps. And there were persistent rumors about a special crew of workers, all of them foreigners who spoke little English, who worked night shifts in the restricted areas and lived in a separate compound outside of town. The three strangers decided to stick together and report to the mines the following morning. They rented rooms at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a ramshackle two-story building that smelled of boiled cabbage and broken dreams. Their landlady, a widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, warned them to keep their heads down and their mouths shut if they wanted to survive in Silver Creek. The next morning brought their first real glimpse of the Consolidated Mining Company's operations. The main mine entrance was carved into a hillside about 2 miles outside of town, surrounded by a maze of processing equipment, or cars, and wooden buildings housing everything from tool sheds to explosive storage. What immediately caught their attention, however, was the security. Armed guards were posted at regular intervals around the complex, and a high wooden fence topped with barbed wire enclosed the entire operation. The 3 men were assigned to different work crews, which meant they had limited opportunities to compare notes during their first few days underground. Thomas found himself hauling cars in the main shaft, backbreaking work that left him exhausted and covered in copper dust. Benjamin was assigned to the sorting shed, where raw ore was separated and graded before being sent to the smelters. Frank, with his experience in railroad construction, was put to work maintaining the narrow-gauge tracks that carried cars throughout the mine complex. It was Frank who made the first disturbing discovery. While repairing track in a section of the mine that was supposedly played out, he noticed that the rails continued far beyond where they should have ended. Following the tracks in secret during his lunch break, he discovered that they led to a heavily guarded area where foreign workers were extracting something that definitely wasn't copper ore. The material was silver-white and unusually heavy, and the workers handling it wore thick gloves and covered their faces with cloth masks. When Frank shared this information with Thomas and Benjamin that evening, they realized they had stumbled onto something significant. Benjamin had noticed similar discrepancies in the sorting shed, where certain batches were immediately separated and sent to a special processing area that regular miners were forbidden from entering. Thomas had overheard guards discussing shipments that were scheduled to leave under cover of darkness, bound for destinations that were never mentioned in the company's official shipping records. Their investigation took a dangerous turn when they decided to explore the restricted area of the mine after hours. Using Frank's knowledge of the tunnel system and Thomas's experience with picking locks, they managed to gain access to the forbidden section during the night shift change. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The foreign workers weren't mining copper at all. They were extracting uranium ore, a rare and valuable mineral that most people in 1887 knew nothing about. But someone in the Consolidated Mining Company clearly understood its potential value, because the operation they discovered was sophisticated and secretive. The uranium ore was being processed, refined, and shipped to unknown buyers under false documentation that listed it as low-grade copper concentrate. Even more disturbing was the evidence they found of the toll this operation was taking on the workers involved. The foreign miners showed signs of radiation sickness, though none of them would have understood what was happening to their bodies. Hair loss, skin lesions, and chronic fatigue were common among the night shift workers, and the company's response was simply to replace sick workers with new immigrants who were desperate enough to take any job, no matter how dangerous. The 3 men realized they had discovered not just a case of corporate fraud, but a systematic poisoning of workers who had no idea they were being exposed to deadly radiation. The question was what to do with this information. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest federal marshal, and even if they could get word to authorities in Santa Fe or Denver, they had no proof that would stand up in court against a powerful mining company. Their dilemma became even more complicated when they learned the identity of the Consolidated Mining Company's silent partners. Through careful observation and eavesdropping, they discovered that the company was backed by a consortium of Eastern investors that included several prominent politicians and businessmen. The uranium they were mining wasn't being sold on the open market. It was being stockpiled for future use by people who understood that this strange new element might have military applications. It was Benjamin who suggested they try to document the operation with photographs. He had some experience with camera equipment from his banking days, and he believed that visual evidence might be more persuasive than their unsupported testimony. The plan was risky, but it seemed like their only chance to expose the truth about what was happening in Silver Creek. Their amateur detective work didn't go unnoticed for long. Harrison Blackwood's security chief, a cold-eyed former cavalry sergeant named Wade Coleman, had been watching the three newcomers since their first day in town. When night guards reported unauthorized personnel in restricted areas of the mine, Coleman began a systematic investigation that quickly identified Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank as potential security threats. The trap was sprung on a Thursday morning when the three men reported for work as usual. Instead of being assigned to their regular duties, they were escorted by armed guards to Blackwood's office in the company headquarters building. The mining company manager was a thin, nervous man in his 40s with pale skin and calculating eyes. He got straight to the point. They had been seen in areas where they didn't belong, asking questions they shouldn't be asking, and showing far too much curiosity about company operations. Blackwood offered them a choice. They could accept a generous severance package and leave Silver Creek immediately, with the understanding that they would never speak about anything they had seen or heard during their brief employment. Or they could face the consequences of industrial espionage and theft, charges that would certainly result in lengthy prison sentences if not worse. Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank exchanged glances, each man realizing that their lives hung in the balance. They had seen enough of Silver Creek to know that Harrison Blackwood didn't make idle threats, and that men who crossed the Consolidated Mining Company had a habit of disappearing permanently. But they also knew that accepting his offer would mean abandoning dozens of workers to slow death from radiation poisoning, while allowing a massive fraud to continue unchecked. It was Thomas who made the decision for all three of them. Looking Blackwood directly in the eye, he refused the offer and demanded to speak with federal authorities about what they had discovered. The mining company manager's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of finality when he informed them that they had made a very poor choice. Within hours, the three men found themselves locked in a storage room behind the company headquarters, under guard and waiting for what they assumed would be a quick trial and execution. Coleman made it clear that Silver Creek operated under company law, not territorial jurisdiction, and that industrial espionage was a hanging offense. The only question was whether they would face a firing squad or a rope. But Harrison Blackwood had overlooked one crucial factor in his plans for dealing with the troublesome miners. Nailnish, the Apache war chief who had been conducting mysterious raids against company operations, had been watching Silver Creek far more carefully than anyone realized. His warriors had observed the arrival of Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank, noted their investigation of the restricted mining areas, and witnessed their capture by company guards. Unlike the white residents of Silver Creek, Nailnish understood exactly what the Consolidated Mining Company was doing in those forbidden tunnels. Apache warriors had been observing mining operations throughout the Southwest for decades, and tribal elders possessed knowledge about the strange glowing rocks that white men were so eager to extract from the earth. They knew that exposure to these materials caused sickness and death, and they had watched with growing anger as mining companies poisoned both the land and the people who lived on it. Nailnish had personal reasons for his war against the Consolidated Mining Company. His younger brother had worked briefly in one of their early uranium extraction sites before the operation moved to Silver Creek. Within months, his brother had developed the wasting sickness that came from handling the cursed ore, dying slowly and painfully as his hair fell out and his body consumed itself from within. When Nailnish learned that the same company was continuing this deadly operation on an even larger scale, he had dedicated his life to stopping them. The Apache leader's plan was both simple and brilliant. Rather than attacking the heavily guarded mine directly, he would rescue the 3 prisoners and help them escape with evidence of the company's crimes. Once the truth about Silver Creek reached federal authorities, the resulting investigation would shut down the uranium operation more effectively than any military raid. On the night before their scheduled execution, Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank heard the sound of gunfire erupting throughout Silver Creek. Nailnish and a dozen of his most skilled warriors had launched a coordinated attack on company facilities, targeting guard posts and communication lines while avoiding civilian casualties. In the confusion that followed, 3 Apache warriors appeared outside the storage room where the prisoners were being held, dispatching their guards with silent efficiency and cutting their bonds with razor-sharp knives. Nailnish himself led the escape party through the chaos of the burning town, his intimate knowledge of the desert terrain allowing them to evade company security forces and disappear into the night. As they rode hard toward the territorial border, the Apache war chief explained his reasons for rescuing them and outlined a plan that would expose the Consolidated Mining Company's crimes to the world. The journey to Santa Fe took them through some of the most dangerous country in the American Southwest, pursued by company mercenaries and dodging military patrols that had been told they were dangerous criminals. Nailnish proved to be not only a skilled warrior, but also a natural leader who kept the group together through determination and tactical brilliance. Along the way, Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank learned to see their Apache rescuer not as the savage portrayed in newspaper stories, but as a man fighting to protect his people and his land from corporate exploitation. When they finally reached the territorial capital, their story created a sensation that reverberated all the way to Washington. Federal investigators descended on Silver Creek, uncovering evidence of fraud, worker endangerment, and environmental contamination that resulted in criminal charges against Harrison Blackwood and several of his corporate backers. The Consolidated Mining Company was dissolved, its assets seized by the government, and its uranium stockpiles placed under federal control. For Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank, the experience had transformed them from desperate men running from their pasts into reluctant heroes who had risked everything to expose the truth. They testified before congressional committees, spoke to newspaper reporters, and helped establish new regulations for mining operations throughout the Western Territories. Nailnish returned to his people, his mission accomplished and his brother's death finally avenged. The Apache leader had proven that sometimes the greatest victories came not from violent confrontation, but from strategic thinking and unexpected alliances. His rescue of the 3 prisoners had not only saved their lives, but also protected countless future workers from the deadly effects of radiation exposure. The town of Silver Creek was abandoned within 6 months, its buildings left to decay in the desert sun, while the poison mine shafts were sealed forever. Local Apache tribes performed purification ceremonies over the contaminated land, hoping to cleanse it of the spiritual poison that had been extracted from deep within the earth. Years later, when Thomas Mitchell had become a successful rancher in Colorado, he would often think about those terrifying days in Silver Creek and the unlikely alliance that had saved his life. He never forgot the lesson that Nailnish had taught him, that courage sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected sources, and that the greatest battles were often fought not with guns and knives, but with truth and determination. The uranium extracted from Silver Creek would eventually play a role in scientific discoveries that changed the world, but the 3 men who had exposed its deadly secret took satisfaction in knowing that future miners would be protected by safety regulations written in response to their testimony. They had learned that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that prevented tragedies rather than avenging them. In the end, their story became legend throughout the Southwest, a tale of ordinary men who found extraordinary courage when faced with impossible choices. They had been marked for death for knowing a deadly secret, but an Apache warrior's unexpected intervention had given them the chance to transform that knowledge into justice for the powerless and forgotten workers of America's industrial frontier. The aftermath of the Silver Creek revelations continued to ripple across the American Southwest long after the abandoned town had been swallowed by desert sands. In the months following their dramatic testimony before Congress, Thomas Mitchell, Benjamin Cole, and Frank Morrison found themselves caught between fame and infamy, celebrated as heroes by some while denounced as troublemakers by powerful mining interests who saw them as threats to profitable operations throughout the region. Thomas used his share of the federal reward money to purchase a small ranch in the Colorado foothills, where he raised cattle and horses far from the poisoned earth of New Mexico. But the nightmares never completely faded. He would wake in the middle of the night, remembering the faces of those foreign workers who had unknowingly sacrificed their health for a few dollars a day, their bodies slowly consumed by radiation they couldn't see, smell, or taste. The knowledge that his testimony had prevented countless similar deaths provided some comfort, but it couldn't erase the memory of what he had witnessed in those forbidden tunnels. Benjamin Cole returned to Missouri, where he used his newfound notoriety to secure a position with a reform newspaper dedicated to exposing corporate corruption. His articles about unsafe working conditions in mines, factories, and railroads helped spark a national conversation about worker safety that would eventually lead to landmark legislation protecting American laborers. He never married, dedicating his life instead to ensuring that no other workers would suffer the fate of those uranium miners whose names were never recorded in any company ledger. Frank Morrison became something of a wandering crusader, traveling from mining camp to mining camp throughout Colorado, Nevada, and Montana, teaching workers about their rights and warning them about dangerous working conditions. His railroad experience made him valuable to mining operations, but his reputation as a whistleblower made him unwelcome in towns controlled by large corporations. He lived a nomadic existence, always moving, always watching, always ready to sound the alarm when he discovered operations that put profits above human lives. The three men maintained contact through letters, sharing information about suspicious mining activities and coordinating their efforts to expose dangerous practices before they could claim more victims. They had become an unofficial network of industrial watchdogs, their experiences in Silver Creek having forged bonds stronger than blood brotherhood. Nailnish's fate proved more complex and tragic than any of them could have anticipated. While his rescue of the three prisoners had accomplished his immediate goal of exposing the uranium mining operation, it had also made him a marked man in the eyes of both military authorities and mining company executives. A bounty was placed on his head, dead or alive, and his movements became increasingly restricted as cavalry patrols scoured the territory searching for the Apache leader who had embarrassed powerful interests. The war chief continued his resistance for another 18 months, but the net was closing around him. His warriors were aging, his resources were dwindling, and the Apache way of life was disappearing as white settlers claimed more territory each year. In a final act of defiance, Nailnish led one last raid against a silver mine in Arizona Territory where he had discovered evidence of worker mistreatment similar to what had occurred at Silver Creek. The raid was successful in terms of its immediate objectives. The mine was shut down and its abusive foremen were driven away, but it proved to be Nailnish's final victory. Surrounded by cavalry troops in a box canyon near the Mexican border, the Apache war chief chose to fight rather than surrender. He fell with a rifle in his hands, his body pierced by a dozen bullets, but his death only added to his legend among both Apache and Mexican communities who saw him as a defender of the oppressed. When news of Nailnish's death reached Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank, each man felt a profound sense of loss and guilt. The Apache warrior had saved their lives and made their mission possible, but they had been unable to protect him from the consequences of his heroic actions. They arranged for a monument to be erected in Santa Fe, honoring not only Nailnish but all the unnamed workers who had died in the uranium mines of Silver Creek. The inscription on that monument, written by Benjamin Cole, captured the essence of what they had all learned during those terrifying days in the desert. Here lies proof that courage knows no boundaries of race or nation, and that the greatest victories belong to those who risk everything to protect the innocent. The monument became a pilgrimage site for labor organizers and civil rights activists, a reminder that justice sometimes required the most unlikely alliances. As the years passed and the three survivors grew older, they watched as the industrial practices they had exposed slowly gave way to safer working conditions and stronger government oversight. The Federal Mine Safety Act, passed largely in response to their testimony, saved thousands of lives by requiring proper ventilation, safety equipment, and medical monitoring in dangerous mining operations. The uranium regulations they had helped establish would prove crucial decades later when the atomic age brought new understanding of radiation's deadly effects. In their final years, Thomas, Benjamin, and Frank would occasionally gather at the Santa Fe Monument, three old men sharing memories of a time when they had faced death and found redemption through an act of extraordinary courage. They would speak of Nailnish with the reverence due a fallen comrade, remembering not the savage portrayed in contemporary newspapers, but the brilliant leader who had taught them that honor transcended the artificial boundaries created by prejudice and fear. Their story became part of American folklore, retold around campfires and in newspaper columns as an example of how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. But for the three men who lived it, the most important legacy wasn't their fame or the laws that bore their names. It was the knowledge that they had kept faith with the voiceless workers whose sacrifice had made their own survival possible. When Thomas Mitchell died in 1923, his funeral was attended by hundreds of miners, ranchers, and reformers whose lives had been touched by his advocacy. Benjamin Cole's obituary in 1927 filled 3 newspaper columns with testimonials from workers who credited him with saving their lives. Frank Morrison lived until 1931, still traveling and teaching right up until his final illness. His railroad car converted into a mobile classroom where he continued sharing the lessons learned in those deadly tunnels beneath Silver Creek. They were buried in different states, but each man's headstone bore the same simple inscription. He knew a deadly secret and refused to stay silent. It was an epitaph that captured not only their courage, but their understanding that some knowledge carries with it the moral obligation to act, regardless of the personal cost. The uranium extracted from Silver Creek eventually contributed to scientific breakthroughs that changed human history, but the 3 men who exposed its deadly extraction took their greatest satisfaction from a simpler achievement. They had proven that in America, truth could still triumph over power, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by armies, but by ordinary people who refused to let injustice pass unchallenged. In the end, their legacy lived on not in monuments or history books, but in the countless workers who went home safely each night because 3 strangers had been willing to risk everything to protect people they had never met. It was a reminder that heroism often wore the face of common decency, and that the most profound victories were measured not in conquest, but in lives preserved and suffering prevented.